Good afternoon and namaste, everyone. We at Indic Researchers Forum, an independent think tank seeking to analyze geopolitics and international relations through a civilizational perspective, are proud to present a two-day international webinar on decoding the idea of communist China under the aegis of the 2.5 Front War chapter, which was launched in the memory of India's first Chief of Defence Staff, late General Bipin Rawat. The webinar is organized in collaboration with Chennai Center for China Studies, which is a public policy think tank carrying out in-depth studies of developments related to China, such as geopolitics, economics, and strategic dynamics. I, Rakesh, a research associate with the forum, will be the anchor for the inaugural session. Napoleon had once clearly prophesied, China is a sleeping giant, let it sleep. If it wakes, it would shake the world. Many analysts had predicted the rise of China to be peaceful. However, today it is safe to say that China under CCP has grown far more belligerent. We must understand China as a civilizational state, where it always had a state-run society owing to the Confucius traditions of its culture. The Chinese civilization remained isolated from the world for several centuries. However, after the Opium War of 1840, the Chinese were pressured into opening their ports for trade. Due to this, China had to sign a set of unequal treaties and subjugation by all imperialist forces, which is also given the moniker of slitting the Chinese lemon, and which was also given the title of the era of humiliation in China. The 20th century was a time of massive transformation within the country. First, the monarchical system ended in 1911. Soon after, a renewed cultural movement emerged, which led to the formation of the Communist Party, which we know today as the Chinese Communist Party or the CCP. From the late 1970s, China instituted various reforms and opened up its vast economy. Military spending significantly increased in the 1990s after Tiananmen Square incident and the Gulf War. Today, China has one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world. Understanding China is one of the key factors in decoding where the world is headed and which new world order will arise in the future. So on this note, I begin with the inaugural session. We have Dr. Pooja Bhatt ma'am as the moderator for this session. Ma'am has received her doctoral degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She is the author of 9-Line, Deciphering the South China Sea Conundrum. Besides working extensively on maritime issues, particularly Indo-Pacific and South China Sea, ma'am writes on the issues related to defense and strategic studies, civil-military relations, nuclear energy, and disarmament. Till recently, she taught as an assistant professor in defense and strategic studies at Rashtriya Raksha University in Gandhinagar. Previously, she worked at Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi, which is an Indian Air Force Research Institute, and Indian Council of World Affairs, a research institute under Ministry of External Affairs India. She has published extensively on several leading platforms in India and abroad as well, and has been a speaker on maritime issues at various reputed international seminars, including US Indo-PACOM Conference in Bangkok, Washington, D.C., Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam in Hanoi, East-West Center in Hawaii, amongst others. Now, Professor Swaran Singh will be delivering the inaugural address, and Lieutenant General Rakesh Sharma sir will be delivering the keynote address. On this note, I hand over the session to Pooja Bhatt ma'am.
Thank you, Rakesh. Good afternoon, everyone. So, People's Republic of China, the country that has been in existence in 1949, still has been an enigma to the outside world. The party founders are professed Marxists who wanted to overthrow bourgeoisie and establish a classless society. Fast forward to 2022, politically, China remains effectively a one-party government under Communist Party of China, which was founded in 1921, effectively completed 100 years anniversary in 2021. So the party predates the country PRC itself. Economically, after Chairman Mao's death in 1976, the Maoist variant of socialism was transformed under the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. Eventually, since 1990s, the economic reforms have been more on the lines of mixed market or socialist market economy with large private enterprises owning up to 15% of the business. And all the businesses in China right now have top representatives in the CPC party. State still owns 85% of the economy because it follows a communist ideology. Again, since 2014, China has been the world's second largest economy as well as second largest military spender in the world. If we see internationally, China remains a supporter of free market capitalist policies. And under Xi Jinping, who came into the power in 2012, the country has ever since seen emergence of its desire to become a global superpower, which is required for its growth and prosperity. So, with this background, some of the questions that arise are, what does communism mean to PRC? And how are the goalposts of communism have shifted since its inception? Have they evolved into something else or not? How has the communist ideology has impacted its domestic political decision making as well as its strategic outlook towards the outside world? And all the dimensions just now I mentioned, politically, economically, militarily, even at the multilateral fora, we have been seeing how China has been reforming its initiative in all these plethora of avenues. So to answer some of these questions require understanding of communism. And then today afternoon, we have all gathered here to get enlightened on these issues by two of the erudite speakers who actually need no introduction, but it's my immense pleasure and honor to introduce each of them. The inaugural address is given by Dr. Swaran Singh, who is a doyen in Chinese strategic thinking and needs no introduction, but he is chair and professor of Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at School of International Studies, JNU. And he's also president at Association of Asia Scholars. He's visiting professor at China West Normal University, Research Institute of Indian Ocean Economies, Kunming, adjunct senior fellow of the Chahar Institute, Beijing, Institute of National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, Sichuan University, Xinjiang College. He is also a member and governing board of Society of Indian Ocean Studies, New Delhi. Professor Singh has supervised 35 PhDs and over 50 MPhil degrees. And I am lucky to be one of those who figure in both his MPhil and PhD degrees supervisees. And he sits on, various selection committees for faculty recruitment on editorial boards of various Secretary General. So with this introduction, may I request Professor Swaran Singh to give the inaugural address for the day, sir.
Thank you, Argish, and also thank you, Pooja. The pleasure could not be more to see one of our own PhD student moderating the inaugural session of this very well-planned two-day conference. I went through the program, and I must compliment both the India Research Forum and the Chennai Center for China Studies for bringing together such bright names and focusing on a subject that really needs a thorough dissection in that sense. And therefore, thank you very much. I feel honored both to be part of the inaugural session and particularly to share this inaugural session with General Rakesh Sharma, who I admire a great deal, and I look forward to listening to him myself. Let me begin by saying I understand the title of today's conference is Decoding the Communist China. Now, there's a debate itself whether there is China beyond the communist China, and I'm sure some of you in the 2 days will have those issues coming up. So that's one issue that I think that could be out for discussion. Mike Pompeo, I remember, was making his best efforts during being Secretary of State in the United States to underline the distinction of the party and society in China. Whereas Xi Jinping has been trying to bring them together as much as possible. The second point very quickly to bring about is that I often love to say that most countries that have some kind of arrangement of people's participation in decision making invariably have multiple parties. China is an unusual example. China is not an example where parties contest as to who will be running the country, Communist Party literally owns China. So very often we say People's Liberation Army, Navy, whether it is of the party or it is state. State itself is that of the party. So that distinction is something important to underline. And that therefore, perhaps when we are saying decoding Communist China, we are fundamentally perhaps underlining that we are decoding the Communist Party of China, which has recently, last year, you saw big celebrations on 1st of July, completing 100 years of being the political party. But it is also now the longest ruling political party. It used to claim to also being the largest political party, but now we know that the Bharatiya Janata Party claims to have a larger number of membership, and therefore that makes Communist Party of China the second largest political party on the planet. Also, we will notice, as Pooja was mentioning briefly, there has been enormous turmoil, almost ridden ups and downs in the political history of last 7 decades of China. Mao himself, like sometimes in India we talk of Nehru being in command of foreign policy from the Brussels Conference of 1928 till his death in 1964, Mao had virtually become an uncontested leader from mid-1930s, 1935, and stayed at the helm till 1976, his death. So 41 years of one man being in command of how he wants to unravel his vision of what Communist China would be, what Communist Party would be. We saw that at some stage he himself, sort of urged the intellectuals of China to say, let 100 flowers bloom. And that was immediately followed by the onset of a great leap forward, followed by cultural revolution, brutal suppression of that sense of freedom that he had unleashed himself. Now, you could notice that happening repeatedly under the successive leaders of China. Of course, that developed a very different kind of nature, scale, magnitude, etc. But that sense of roller coaster ride in that sense has continued. And the simple reason that China has now emerged to be world's largest economy in purchasing power terms, second largest military spender, the greatest destination for foreign investments, largest holder of foreign exchange, so many things that make China inevitably upfront for everyone around the world, in that sense, largest trading partner, rapidly rising investor, and so on. And therefore, there are some kind of stereotypes that we often hear when we talk of, need for decoding some of the puzzle that China increasingly becomes for everybody. It was puzzle for several people earlier. You remember Europeans had come into China from 18th century onward to unravel the mystery. But now that mystery seems to be everybody's concern. So we hear expressions like inscrutable Chinese, or we hear about reading the proverbial tea leaves, discussing why Belt and Road Initiative is called Belt and Road Initiative. But increasingly, for coming few months, I think we will be going to be increasingly intrigued by the succession, the black box of succession that more or less was put in place under Deng Xiaoping in terms of developing collective leadership, each group of leaders leading for a decade, and then, of course, announcing the successive leaders. So that part is going to be, I think, the more hyped up media headlines grabbing puzzle of China that we notice. But I think, let me also say at this stage, any party that has a size that Chinese Communist Party has, inevitably, has to have various factions, various disjunctions, various disagreements. It cannot be a very clearly regimented monolith, even if, as we say, it kind of shows calm at the exterior, but constantly facing the volatility inside, which sometimes shows outside also. So it's like the footwork of a duck swimming in a pond kind of a situation that you notice. A lot of footwork happens, sometimes very, very violent, but attempt to ensure exterior calmness of the party, and therefore decorum, therefore kind of aesthetics, discipline, organization of all events that party does almost go to the extent of obsession of October parades, where you see that the cadets who are marching are even blinking eyes in tandem. So that is the obsession of showcasing exterior being extremely calm. But here, I think it is important to very quickly jump now to the recent interest in decoding China or decoding communist China. The newspaper called Tribune had recently reported, I think a few months back, maybe in December, that the Tibetan researchers, there was a Center for Human Studies, Human Rights and Democracy, I think, that they had started a database titled Decoding Chinese Communist Party over the phases. So there is a kind of a formal attempt. Though, understanding Chinese mindset or decoding China is a favorite title for several books and articles over years. Likewise, in December, the Foreign Affairs Journal had an article by Yunjun Ang titled Decoding Xi Jinping. So why I'm saying this is that increasingly not just Communist Party begins to be owning China, but perhaps increasingly scholars are alluding to how Xi Jinping becomes synonymous with China increasingly. At least that is how the things are being kind of projected. So the article talked of decoding Xi Jinping and how, he says, will Chinese bureaucrats interpret Xi's call for common prosperity. So here two things are significant to understand why China or communist China remains a puzzle. One is the very nature of Communist Party. Communist Party, like many other revolutionary and violent liberation movement guiding parties, was set up initially as a secretive organization in Shanghai. All of you understand and remember that. And of course, that tradition more or less continues to be as mundane as when I was for the first time going as an exchange teacher in Beijing University in 2000. My colleagues would go for several meetings which are called only Chinese meetings. And when they will come back, they will almost feel guilty saying, oh, no, we don't discuss anything that you don't know, but it is a tradition that we don't want to break. So the traditions, therefore, particularly in civilizational states, traditions are very, very strong, and it is not easy to break traditions. Likewise, symbolisms are very important, not easy to break in that sense. And the sense of secrecy, therefore, is writ large in all of these meetings. You have seen recently, for example, how Xi Jinping's China, particularly Hu Jintao's China, was promoting brand China. And you saw, I think in early 2000s, 4 out of 10 top brands of multinational corporations in the world, 4 out of 10 were Chinese. Today, there is 0 in the top 10 international brands. And that clearly talks about the recent crackdown that has happened on celebrities, on multinational corporations, on media. And in that sense, the cycle of allowing freedom and jackboot policy. Likewise, for example, Deng Xiaoping had brought in People's Liberation Army as the strongest force in unleashing the opening up and restructuring of Chinese economy. So People's Liberation Army was the most powerful economic powerhouse until Jiang Zemin brought legal injunctions to remove PLA out of commercial enterprises. So that cycle kind of has more or less continued over a period of time. Why I'm saying that is that when China becomes everybody's concern around the world because of its enormous rise, particularly post-pandemic, China is talking about its being a $16 trillion economy even in current dollar terms. And in that sense, that China is of concern because it is so difficult to understand both the mindsets, the phraseologies, the trends, the political alignments. And because this juggernaut which is rising constantly, making world really increasingly engaged and almost dependent on this rising China, that animal is difficult to decipher, is why this kind of unusual effort needs to be made to decipher or decode China. I'll give you a few, just 2-3 instances, and I'll close after that. I'm sure I should not speak far too much. Like many countries, including our own country, you will sometimes notice the kind of expressions that are used in domestic constituencies, their translations in English do not really represent the message which is being given domestically. And I'm not sidelining China as the only country that showcases that example. Sometimes we say there are expressions in our own languages that actually do not have exact English substitutes. So therefore, we pick up the nearest word possible. So for instance, in China now, the debates are moving away from what is called Chungko, which is a central, this is how we name our country. That is the most central to our identity. Chungko was seen as Middle Kingdom. Now, increasingly in grapevine meetings, at least very openly, the word being shifted to now called Tianchao. Chungko is being shifted to Tianchao, which is a celestial kingdom which talks about gods and goddesses, and unquestioned power is eluded here. Which means that it is not Middle Kingdom where kings can be removed by farmers, protests, if you go back to Chinese history. So this shifting from Chungko to Tianchao does not come across in English debates on China very often. And likewise, another expression becoming popular, for example, is Kuiko. Kuiko, Kui is every day we use in the market. When you go to buy something, you tell shopkeeper, Chahan Kui, this is too expensive. But when you say Kuiko, it translates in English as expensive country, but it actually in Chinese symbolism means your honorable country. You're going back to feudalism. Your Majesty's most humble servant. You would remember our own history in India, how Indians used to write to the Majesty. So this kind of, or another very almost controversial now banned on WIPO expression is Larao. Larao is a salted meat or preserved meat. But when you say Mao Larao, it means Mao's body which is kept on Tiananmen Square. And that had become very controversial, and it's a word which is now almost banned on WIPO. In no context you can talk of salted meat, which is a normal expression. People talk about salted meat. But when you begin to have connotations of it, it creates enormous difficulties. Two big examples of leaders. Hu Jintao, you remember, had popularized this whole idea of harmonious society, harmonious Asia, harmonious world. He spoke about it, and he's known for that in English. But the Chinese word for that was Puchithang. Puchithang means free of turmoil. Free of turmoil is not harmony. Some of you who study peace studies or conflict resolution, you understand positive, negative, peace. Harmony is very different, but in English translation, it's called harmony. Whereas he's talking of removing turmoil from society. Now that has very different connotations. More interesting, recently again, you notice there was initial controversy about one belt, one road as a strategy, as if there is one way, all roads to Beijing. So in English, Chinese have shifted to Belt and Road Initiative, saying this is an initiative and we will work through consultations and develop the strategy later. But in Chinese, this has not changed. There is nothing like Belt and Road Initiative in Chinese. It is still Itai Law. Itai Lu is still one belt, one road. Now, what that one belt and one road means, I sometimes joke with my Chinese friends, even they do not know, but it's a slogan and everybody follows it. So how you conceive your country, how do you have major slogans given by very powerful leaders? Those disjunctions make outsiders extremely concerned and curious to know as to what we are hearing and what we are seeing. Is that what the intentions are? Lately, wolf warrior diplomacy is another popular expression coming in English. Now, let me close by saying India next door is another peer civilizational state. Should it bring India a certain advantage? And if we compare how we use symbolisms in India, how we use certain ancient phrases, and they find it very difficult to translate them in English. English do not give you exact translation of the deep connotations that civilizational states' languages develop. Over millennia, words carry enormous baggage behind them. So does it mean that India should be therefore a leading country to be able to decode the Chinese Communist Party or the Chinese Communist state, or lately you're hearing, including India's foreign minister talking about India's foreign policy is no longer aimed at pleasing the world. You're hearing him say that, or pleasing the Chinese. Does that bring India any advantage in terms of, engaging with this kind of an exercise? I saw that this is part of a 2.5 war chapter, this particular conference. That again makes China important. Whether in direct Chinese war or in India-Pakistan war or in internal crisis in China, China has so far been very reluctant, even in bilateral conflicts. Will China continue to be reluctant? And I'm quickly alluding to how West is contributing to Ukraine's fight against Russia. You don't see much contribution in the overt transactions that are happening. But you have to appreciate covert support that West has provided in enabling Ukraine to withstand Russia. We are now in third month. Will Chinese develop something of that kind, that we will not be able to see and continue to believe Chinese reluctance, caution, whereas things may be changing very differently? Look at Chinese investments in your all e-commerce, in your infrastructure, power, telecom, in your startups. Largest imports come from China. Active pharmaceutical ingredients all come from China, making India pharmacy of the world. Is that some inscrutable Chinese strategy that India needs to be really careful of? And how do we do that? Because at some stage, this interaction, intercourse between these two societies is inevitable. Constantly connectivity is expanding. Are there possibilities of socializing China? If we are decoding China, we are learning about things that are quintessential Chinese. Are Chinese learning things that are quintessentially Anglo-Saxon or Indic? That also is something that I think could be an area of discussion in these 2 days. But I'm very conscious. I think I was not told how long to speak. So let me say China continues to throw enormous challenges for simple 2 reasons. A, because it is now reaching in everybody's home around the world. Second, because when it is reaching in everybody's home, it is not a transaction, it is not an actor that is easy to understand. It is an actor that undergoes repeated phases of cyclical volatility. And for our own national interest, for our own personal basic interests, we need to really, therefore, get a grip on, do we understand China? And therefore, I think this kind of a 2 days conference on decoding the communist China can help a great deal in putting a lot of our anxieties to relief, and also enabling India to engage China from a vantage point of being a peer civilizational state next door, which is all set to become at least the largest country in terms of population. But if you look at the growth rates endorsed by the IMF now, it's also likely to be an economic challenge to China. How those kind of disjunctions are going to be resolved would demand decoding China. With that, I put an end to my initial remarks. I look forward to listening to General Sharma and, of course, other participants of the 2 day seminar. My best wishes to the 2 days discussions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, sir. And having known Professor Singh for over 10 years, I still cannot fathom that how he can speak on a topic like this within like the time frame of 10-15 minutes and still delivering so many thought points for the public. So I would not want to repeat what he said, but there are very crucial points that he brought out in his talk. 2 of them I would quickly want to put out for the audience again to think over, and maybe the next speakers will talk about it. One is how China traditionally think about its own civilization state, and how it wants to convey itself to the rest of the public. And lots of that conversation is lost in translation. That we, when try to decode China, do not correctly translated from Chinese or Mandarin to English, and that's the biggest problem that the world finds in decoding China. Is one of the very crucial point that Professor Singh rightly brought out. And another issue is about how China would want to open up and learn about the world as we are trying to learn about China and decode it. So I think with this, we would like to take the discussion to the next speaker. Our next speaker again is a very erudite scholar and a practitioner, Lieutenant General Dr. Rakesh Sharma. He is an infantry officer commissioned in Gorkha Rifles in 1977, and he had a long career of 40 years. And he is the right person to be talking about China at the moment on the operational side. So with that, I'll hand over the mic to Lieutenant General Sharma. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Pooja. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. I remember once upon a time, about 25 years ago, I was delivering a paper at IDSA, and Professor Swaran Singh was the critique, and he thrashed the hell out of me. And that taught me how to research a subject. It was great learning experience to say how a subject needs to be addressed. And that was it. IDSA, Professor Swaran Singh will not remember me. I was a young colonel. Not that I'm not young now, but I was a younger colonel. And it was an immense experience. So thank you, Professor Swaran Singh. What a pleasure listening to you always. Thank you, Indic Researchers Forum, for this opportunity to come and speak today. And thank you for not telling me how much time I have. Like you didn't tell Professor Swaran Singh, I also don't know how much time I like to speak. So I'm just starting off, and you can tell me sometime, okay, enough. One good thing that I heard today from Professor Swaran Singh, and I like it, is that when we used to 20 years ago spoke about decoding China, we didn't know a dime about China. We were lost cases, In our formative years, we were actually wanting to say the word use inscrutable faces. They were inscrutable faces. We had no idea. Today, there are people of great academic value like Professor Swaran Singh and like many others you hear across who say there is no need to decode. We are all right. We are understanding China. It is not we of 80s. We are we of the 21st century. And we do read and we do understand, and we also want to understand the nuances of the Chinese language. So there is a transition that has happened even in India. Our expertise has gone up many-fold, and while the West may still not be able to understand, we as a civilizational country do tend to go into depth of issues. So border is just one small issue. Now we know much more about China, and at least there is a desire to learn, which when we discuss China, it is so interesting. So I'm going to say my few words on this, and of what one has deciphered, or what one can decipher, especially in the context of later. Look at this 5,000 word document signed on 4th of February between Putin and Xi Jinping. It's a learning experience to read how people deal with each other. That's the thing, and how it has been decoded in India also in this 5,000 word document. So very interesting things happening across on the thing. We all understand that the CCP's geopolitical ambitions and global ambitions are not a secret. Now everybody knows it. It's as clear as possible, and President Xi has clearly made it that China has to be a predominant power in Asia and also in the world. And he wants to consolidate all that he has in the course of his tenure. Hopefully, as the black box, as is rightly said, the black box sorts out end of this year, he'll get another 5 years. And those 5 years will be critical to the world. That's because President Xi will have to prove to himself and to the Communist Party of China that this is the time. You gave me the right extension of 5 years, and you gave me the right decision was taken. That will be the next 5 years, and this decade will be very important to us. And having said that, this so-called Chinese dream has been so associated with President Xi in this manner. He spoke about the Chinese dream in 2012. There was a United States dream earlier, but this dream, he sounded it, and it was a clarion call. He says, okay, I rejuvenate the Chinese nation in times of my tenure. And he wanted people to dare to work. there is a transition. So the Communist Party is equal to Z, Z is equal to China. 7% of the population of China is only the Communist Party. But they control 135, 140 billion people. Look at the kind of control that they exercise over the country. So the question that I've been asking is, how does China want to redeem its past glory, and how does it want to get out of the so-called century of humiliation, and how does it want to reach the global stage, which is the method that the Chinese want to take. If that superpower is the destination that he wants to reach, and 2050 the time is given that after the moderately well-off society, etc., how does he want to reach? First is, does he want to reach through economics totally, or through his periphery, the land and the maritime frontier? Does he want to bring the regional power as a springboard to global power? Or he wants to sort out the Indo-Pacific to reach out the global power? How does he want to reach the global power? Now, the emerging wisdom which one reads and one tries to decipher over a period of 2 decades, it's not Xi's tenure alone. It's also the tenure of Hu Jintao and that era which started at the turn of this century, which saw the change coming in. China does not, my personal view is that it does not want to reach the global influence, but it wants to first do it by establishing a regional hegemony. Without a regional hegemony, it won't be able to reach a global power. That does not mean actually he wants to physically occupy all the nations across in the periphery, except with the exception of Taiwan. But it does mean that it wants to become the dominant power into these areas in Indo-Pacific. And of course, the first island chain, which runs from Japan on one side to Taiwan to Philippines and the South China Sea. And then therefore also he wants to have an effective veto over the security and economic choices of all the neighbors. And to do that, it have to rupture the alliance system that the Americans have built up over a long period of time in this region, and push the Americans as far as possible. I know one interesting, the SINPAC, the CNC of the Pacific Command had given a presentation last year to the Senate committee. The slides got leaked out by mistake. One of the issues that the leaked out slide said that, look, the sea-skimming missiles that the Chinese have pushed the Pacific Command 1,000 kilometers away from the Chinese borders. It's a very interesting formulation brought out by the admiral when he spoke in the Senate committee last year in the month of March. So all this is very interesting things happening across into this. If Chinese cannot sort out its periphery first, then it have to focus its energies on making sure that military energies to making sure that it does so to achieve the ambitions. So as long as United States retains a strong military position along the first island chain, regional powers like India, like Vietnam, like Taiwan, like Japan, maybe on periphery Australia, will resist China's rise simply to accommodate it. Put simply, China cannot become a true global power in 2050 if it remains surrounded by inimical territories and United States and security partners, military bases and outposts of hostile superpowers. So that break is what China is wanting to achieve to reach that status. Now, why does I have 4 small issues which I wish to raise before moving forward. One is, why does there is increasing mention of the word sovereignty as far as China is concerned, and what is China trying to do to redraw its geography? Second is, how is it trying to gain global influence, and is it gaining global influence? Third, all this talk about insulating the economy, the dual circulation policy, the common prosperity that's come off late, how is it wanting to insulate a second largest economy in the world from a global economy? And fourth is, how is China working hard to get involved into global governance? A methodology which has been developed over a period of 20, 30 years in which they are wanting to permeate across to global governance. Those are 4 critical issues in understanding China's rise, China's growth across to global ambitions. Now, sovereignty is a recent phenomenon. They still believe in Panchsheel, or the 5 principles of coexistence, which was proclaimed in April 1954. And first of these principles was mutual respect to each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty. Any study of Chinese later day actions says that this is one principle of 5 principles that Chinese jettisoned at the drop of a hat once they wanted to get on to international power. Whether it happened when they joined the WTO in 2001 or whether it happened in 2008, 2007, 2008 subprime crisis, which were the key areas where China really took off. But then by 2013, Xi has clearly linked sovereignty with the accomplishment of Chinese dream. And he said, no foreign country should expect to trade our core interest, and to expect China will swallow a bitter flute on encroachments upon its sovereignty will not be acceptable. In 2018, when the US Secretary of State was visiting, he told James Mattis that China cannot lose even an inch of territory left behind by the ancestors. It gives clear indications to all peripheral nations that there is a meaning behind what Chinese want to do in matters of security. And so the emphasis on the word sovereignty again and again and again shows China's intentions in the neighborhood. There are large swaths of land it's already occupying in South China Sea. It is not bothered about the losing of the case with the Philippines on Spratly Islands, and it's not bothered. It's territorial, changing laws of territory, laws of coastal waters, maritime laws, laws of the territorial borders. So it's all, and getting grip of Hong Kong. The entire gamut of peripheral affairs is changing in the course of last 7 to 8 years in the Chinese. And also now lately they started talking about Chinese sovereignty over cyber domain. Now going into intangibles when they say that the international cyberspace order will be based on state sovereignty. Now we are getting into nebulous areas which are not even spoken about in normal thing. That's what Chinese are getting into. So there is issues on sovereignty. Second is the issue which I worry it is about Chinese global influence. One knows that 126 countries' largest trade is with China. India has got more trade with China than it has with the United States. And it wants to reach, sometime he said he wants to be last year, President Xi said he wants to become a lovable, credible and respectable country. Well, Chinese may have the best of trade, but who wants to love China? Well, one has doubts about this lovable part of it. And it suggests that, it also suggests that China faces a severe soft power deficit. People may have trade. Sri Lankans may be hawked by it, but Sri Lankans would not love China. Neither would the Bangladeshis would. And nor would be many of these countries in Africa which are totally indebted to China. So its behavior, its ability to influence the behavior of the nation is not based on its cultural moorings and heritage of centuries old. It is based on some kind of force, whether it is economic force or whatever form it wants to use it. So there are economic leverages to persuade people to have political preferences of the Chinese choice. And that's why maybe Taiwan is still not been recognized by most nations of the world. And nobody wants to do this also. And if Lithuania tries it, Chinese squeeze Lithuania so badly. That's the global influence by coercion. This is, a significant set of Chinese global economic power that have reached, which is lending itself to global influence. In last 2 decades, it has established itself as a global power and solidified its role into this one. See, 10 of these ports being made in Europe. The largest port, Piraeus, is in Greece, which supplies the entire European continent. 4,000 trains last year, 2021, went from China to Europe. Trains loaded with stuff, with the German Porsches and BMWs and Mercedes-Benz being supplied by the trains being carried across. That's why the influence of the Chinese with the Europeans is such large. In 2019, China surpassed the number of countries it had diplomatic relations with, and the number of diplomats it had in the world much beyond what United States has. It's the kind of permeation that they're doing across there. And it's the aid budget, foreign aid budget increased by 7% only to 2020, 2 years ago. So there is a change. Largely, this change is coming, influence is coming by method of coercion, but it is effective in this manner. Third part is the global governance system. Has China trying? A lot of people have spoken about WHO and the Chinese control on WHO. The previous boss of WHO was a lady from China. The present boss of WHO has some kind of links with the Chinese. Is this by game plan, or is China wanting to reach global governance by deliberate methodology? So, it came back to international system in 1970s. It was a weak role that China had those years. And as his economy grew, as Deng Xiaoping came across, and they started taking more and more active role in global governance. By 2010, China surpassed Japan to become the second biggest economy and earned the third greatest percentage of votes in World Bank in IMF. This is about 12 years ago. Meanwhile, Chinese nationals ascended to international organization. Margaret Chan, as I said, became the Director General of WHO. As of today, of the 15 large UN organizations, 4 of them are headed by the Chinese, and there are many others where Chinese are in nearly helm of affairs. So it's a kind of Chinese international control that they are wanting to build in the global governance. And many of these organizations have significant amount of influence on budget and many other things that the Chinese are doing. So there is a intense amount of change. They are also creating alternative institutions. Now SCO was created, then they started the RCEP and the AIIB Bank. So many of these institutions have become institutions led by the Chinese, which are contrary to the global institution, or maybe adding on to the global institution, but largely with the Chinese influence. So that's the alternative institutions being created by the Chinese. And they have also started putting a foot down on internet governance. This is a start on the last 4 or 5 years ago when they unveiled the plans to make China the cyber superpower. So there are dramatic changes happening on Chinese gradually going across to global governance. I will, I'm also reaching on the end of my talk on these issues, and all of you know the economic issues, so I'm not going to labor the influence. But suffice it to say, if the Chinese roadmap you see of the 14th five-year plan in March 2021, it has clear indication that we are already a moderately developed countries. 3 times the level of 2020 was being shown in 2021. But 2035, they are wanting to reach some level. There have been great trade deals made by the Chinese in the course of last few years. One with the 15 Asia Pacific countries and one with European Union. The way they're moving on FTAs is nobody's business. The RCEP, the comprehensive agreements that bind it with European Union, the China standards of 2035 technology, which they want to establish themselves, the way they are pushing yuan to become an alternative currency to the dollar, the Huawei, which of course many countries have already accepted, many countries that haven't accepted it. So there is an economic leverage which is also being carried out in a manner. This is not to say all is hunky-dory, all is well. Some sites said that there are 100,000 protests which were carried out in various parts of China last year. We know what's happening in Shanghai today. Okay, I'll end by saying what's happening in the Ukraine war and how does it affect China, and what do we see China taking advantage. So my good take is that I think the Chinese are happy with the distraction that the West has taken on their head, the distraction of the Americans focused on this one. This is an opportunity which Chinese have taken advantage ever in life. 2008, when and the global war on terror, anytime this thing happened, Chinese took advantage of an incident happening somewhere else and took their distraction away and took advantage of the side. So I think they'll be gainers in many ways, and they are deep people, and they will think in a deep manner. So I will end here by saying, on the territorial frontiers, China is creating benign borders. This is my view on it. And by benign borders, I mean is that they are making sure that they don't get tense issues on the territorial borders, and that's why my logic about fixation on buffers, etc., that they're creating, but it's not friction points. I think we've lost the game by talking the word friction points. He has created a benign excitation. He pushed us away and created a buffer on the entire excitation. And this is what China is, the benign territorial borders, so that the Chinese have a safe territory and they can focus themselves towards the other side, which is the maritime frontier, which is the issue, the maritime periphery that worries the Chinese more. And in that manner, China has also sorting out long-term interests in commodities, which is oil, gas, wheat, agri products, and all this. And maybe this distraction will be advantageous to Chinese to so that. Ending it here, having said that there may be a benign border with the Chinese, the infrastructure being created opposite us, and some of us who follow the cantonments and garrisons being built across us, we need to be conscious of the fact. And we also need to be conscious of the fact is the number of places in the Indian Ocean rim countries where they are building the ports or having some kind of fingers into many pies. So there are anxieties we must not forget about in this manner, because we could be a challenger in times to come. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say whatever I wanted to say.
Thank you, Journalist Sharma, and it was absolutely an elucidating talk. And you actually touched upon a lot of operational and practical issues where China needs to be decoded. I think with this firm foundation on Chinese approach towards communism, the practical and the operational and even the ideological steps and how it impacts the political decision making within China and outside, we can look forward to the next 2 days of this workshop, where several of the themes that were discussed and touched upon by the two inaugural and speakers will be discussed individually by the reputed scholars. With this, I will want to hand over the mic to the anchor. Thank you very much.
With this, we conclude our inaugural session. We thank Pooja ma'am for moderating the inaugural session. Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh sir and Lieutenant General Rakesh Sharma sir, for your valuable perspectives and giving a powerful start to our conference. With this, we come to the end of the inaugural session of the international webinar.